Steve pressed the back of his hand against his brow, wiping away the sweat that had gathered there during his slow trek across the endless expanse of shifting orange sand. Though he wore only a light undershirt, his skin felt as if it were on fire beneath the relentless glare of Nephus's twin suns. In the distance, heat shimmered, distorted the horizon, making distant rock formations waver like phantoms. He paused momentarily to glance over his shoulder at the hoversled he was dragging, loaded with supplies and equipment for him and his partner, Lorena. The planet's scorching wind blew dry dust into his eyes, but he had grown used to the sting by now. In spite of his best efforts, the trek was exhausting. He felt the heat sapping his energy more than any battlefield he had ever fought on, or any raid he had ever carried out in the name of profit. Years as a mercenary had taught him how to pace himself in hostile environments, yet Nephus tested every ounce of that training. He remembered the briefing from the Galactic Heritage Foundation, GHF for short, that described Nephus as hot and arid, but none of their warnings compared to the reality of the harsh desert. Even so, he pushed onward, cursing under his breath as he trudged toward the strange, towering structures ahead. He did not have much choice. The prize he sought was rumored to be hidden inside these ruins, and the money at stake was too great to ignore. Before meeting Lorena, Steve might have approached this job with grim determination and little else. But Lorena, with her enthusiasm for history and her almost childlike curiosity about ancient civilizations, had a way of making each trek feel like an adventure, even if the environment was trying to kill them. He imagined her at his side right now, probably pointing out the swirling patterns in the red stone pillars or chattering about the once mighty Nephian civilization that had thrived here centuries or millennia ago. There was a brightness to her that offset the darkest corners of his mercenary instincts, a brightness he had come to respect. Despite his initial doubts, he finally spotted her figure in the distance, near the entrance to a partially buried pyramid-like structure. Her vibrant yellow skin almost glowed under the sun, making her impossible to mistake for a human. Her posture was alert, and she used the scanning device on her left wrist to examine the elaborate carvings in the stone. Just as he reached her, she turned to greet him, silver hair catching the hot wind. She offered him a brief, tired smile. He could see the dust caked around her eyes and across her cheeks, but she didn't complain. She never did. "Steve," she said in that melodic yet slightly accented tone that set her apart from any human he knew, "I think I've found a clue. These carvings match some of the references I saw in the texts on the ship. The architecture is definitely Nephian. We're on the right path." He set down the hoversled and squinted at the stone wall. Symbols shifted beneath the swirling sand that occasionally gusted through the ruin, and he made out spirals, lines, and a script he recognized only because of Lorena's explanations in the past. He could make no sense of them. "Looks like someone's scribbles to me," he said. "Then it's a good thing I'm here," Lorena teased, brushing dust off a series of etched lines. "According to my records, the transmutation matrix is supposed to be in the heart of a major temple. This might be it, or it might be another outpost. The script says something about the Guardian of Change. I need to translate more precisely once we're inside." He nodded. "Let's go in carefully. No telling what sort of surprises the Nephians left behind. Besides, you remember the directions from GHF. Bring back the artifact no matter what. If it's worth half of what they claim, we'll be set for life." He almost snorted at that thought. He knew GHF's routine: promise big payouts but keep mercenaries like him guessing about the true nature of the artifact. Lorena, though, was always more interested in knowledge than credits. They made their way into the temple's antechamber. At first it was blessedly cool in comparison to the scorching desert. The walls were lined with thick pillars of dark polished stone. Lorena swept her wrist device across every surface, taking readings and muttering to herself about the energy signatures that still lingered after all these years. Steve, on the other hand, kept an eye out for traps or mechanical defenses. He had plenty of experience with ancient ruins that still bristled with lethal surprises. But as they moved deeper, he found none of the typical alarm signals. The corridor eventually opened into a wide central chamber, lit by faint shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the high ceiling. In the center stood a squat altar carved from black stone that seemed to absorb all light. Even from a distance, Steve could see a small, cube-like object resting on it, pulsing softly with a gentle glow. He could also feel the hair on his arms rise, as if the air itself were charged with static. Instinct told him to move slowly. "This might be it," Lorena breathed, stepping forward with her scanner. "The transmutation matrix. I can't believe it's just sitting there, unguarded." She halted at a sign from Steve, who had his pulse rifle at the ready. "Unguarded is never good," he said. "Check your readings." She nodded, rotating her wrist so that the holographic display projected more data. "There's a strong energy field emanating from that cube. It's unlike any power source I've ever seen." Steve circled around, looking for pressure plates or hidden devices in the floor. The only sign of technology was the faint hum and the mesmerizing glow of the cube. Guess the Nephians had more subtle ways of keeping intruders at bay. Lorena approached with cautious steps. She ran her scanner across the altar, not making physical contact yet. Her eyebrows knitted and her voice dropped to a whisper. "The reading suggests this device is storing matter-altering capabilities, possibly to shift organic or inorganic material between states. It's far more advanced than I expected." He shifted his weight, torn between letting her do her research and wanting to yank her back for safety's sake. But Lorena's curiosity overrode caution. She leaned closer, enthralled by the cryptic symbols etched into each face of the cube. "I can see writing here, Nephian script. Maybe if I just..." She lifted her hand, intending to hover her fingers over the surface to read the text more closely, but to Steve's horror, her fingertip brushed against a glowing symbol. He didn't even have time to shout. A brilliant flash erupted from the cube, and a lance of bluish light struck Lorena in the chest. She staggered backward, letting out a strangled cry as she clutched at the point of impact. The artifact's pulse quickened, flaring with alarming intensity. Steve lunged forward to grab her, but he could already see her skin changing color, from warm yellow to a dull, lifeless gray that spread across her hands and upper forearm. "Lorena!" he shouted, his heart pounding. She collapsed into his arms, and he tried to keep her upright. The petrification raced across her shoulders, crawling up her neck. She stared at him, eyes wide with terror. Her lips tried to form words, but no sound emerged. "No, no, no," Steve muttered, adrenaline flooding his system. He had faced death before, but not like this. He could do nothing, as within seconds, her entire body was replaced by stone, her final expression frozen in anguish. The glowing artifact dimmed as if satisfied, leaving him cradling the cold statue that had been a living, breathing person moments ago. He cursed, scanning the chamber with desperate eyes, expecting more beams of light or some automated attack, but the threat seemed contained to that one blast. Sweat poured down his face. Carefully, he eased the statue of Lorena to the ground. He tapped the stone tentatively, hoping to find some softness underneath, but it was as rigid as granite. Her form was perfectly preserved, every contour of her face and body intact, but stone nonetheless. Gritting his teeth, he lifted the statue. Even with his well-developed muscles and combat training, she was heavier in this state. He had to shift her weight across his shoulders, mindful of the possibility that if she fell, she could shatter. "Stay with me," he whispered, though she was clearly beyond hearing. Still, it felt wrong not to speak. She was his partner. More than that, a friend, and he refused to accept she was gone. The GHF data had hinted that the Nephians had ways of reversing the transmutation matrix's effects, though details were scarce. If there was even a sliver of hope, he would chase it. He left the chamber, stumbling under Lorena's stony weight, retracing their path through the corridors. Occasionally he heard an ominous scraping sound that reminded him of brittle stone. He clenched his jaw and pushed forward. Outside, the desert heat slammed into him like a wall, but it was a perverse relief compared to the unnatural chill in that temple. He hurried across the sand toward their ship, the Star Seeker, anchored on a flat stretch of rock. By the time he entered the airlock, his arms ached and his lungs burned from exertion. The cargo bay had a small medical station, complete with a diagnostic scanner. Steve carefully placed Lorena on the exam table, wincing at the clunk of stone against metal. "Ship," he managed to say, voice cracking. "Full diagnostic scan on Lorena, on my partner. Now." The AI's monotone response came promptly. "Acknowledged." A ring of green light passed over the statue's surface, scanning. Steve watched the readouts with growing dread. The ship recognized an organic pattern that had been transmuted on a molecular level. Beneath the mineral shell, something faintly biological remained, but it was locked in stasis. The system gave him no guarantee she was still alive, only that some minimal energy signature flickered, inconclusive. He tore through Lorena's personal effects to find her data tablet. It was password protected, but he had learned a few hacking tricks in his time. After a few attempts, he guessed the password based on something she had once told him about Earth sunsets. Sure enough, the device unlocked. She had extensive research on the Nephian civilization, including references to a restoration temple. The notes suggested that if someone were petrified by the Matrix, there was a chance to revert them. The text was unclear on the risk or method, but any chance was better than nothing. He felt anger flaring, directed at himself for not stopping her. But he swallowed it. No point blaming himself when time was precious. Another snippet in Lorena's notes revealed the likely location of the Restoration Temple, on the far side of Nathus. A long flight, and then possibly a trek through canyons that were too narrow for the ship. He doubted the medical gear on board could replicate whatever advanced procedure the Nephians used. The ship's AI provided estimates for how quickly she might degrade in this form. The fractures were already beginning, hairline cracks near her shoulder. The projection gave her 72 hours before catastrophic structural failure. He pulled off his dust-stained shirt and tossed it aside, then began prepping the ship's engines. It felt strange to be so focused on logistics when Lorena's life hung in the balance, but that was the nature of survival. He cursed the environment, the GHF for not telling them more, the Nephian ruins for being so damned lethal. He also cursed himself for needing to rely on a half-deciphered set of instructions from an alien tablet to save the only real friend he had out here. The Star Seeker lifted off in a haze of dust, engines straining against the scorching air. Steve poured on as much thrust as the ship could handle. The route to the temple took them through a stretch of swirling storms, meteorological anomalies that Nephus's binary star system often generated. Turbulence rocked the cabin. He grimly checked the readouts on Lorena's condition. The fractures were spreading, her stone body gradually weakening. A wave of helpless anger overcame him, but he channeled it into his focus on the flight. As the storms battered the hull, he found himself talking to her, even though she was just a silent statue. He whispered regrets, confessions of how he had admired her calm intellect and her unwavering curiosity about the galaxy's lost civilizations. He admitted he found her alien beauty captivating, even though he had tried to maintain a professional wall. He confessed that, in moments like these, he realized how little money or reputation truly mattered. She was the reason he wanted to succeed in life, because she never stopped believing there was more to discover. When the turbulence finally subsided, Steve managed to guide the Star Seeker toward the coordinates Lorena's data indicated. The landscape below was a network of steep canyons carved out by ancient rivers. He circled to find an adequate landing site, eventually settling on a flat plateau. The temple site itself was still several kilometers away, nestled in a deep gorge. Lugging a stone statue on foot through these canyons would be grueling, but there was no alternative. After landing, he prepped a basic hover sled to carry Lorena. He wrapped her carefully in padding, ensuring no part of her stone form would be jostled. Sweat rolled down his brow as he manhandled the statue onto the sled. He double-checked the gun strapped across his back, the water supply, the survival gear. Then he headed out into the blazing sun once more. The canyon entrance loomed like a great gash in the planet's surface, walls of red rock stretching high above. He navigated tight passages, careful to keep the sled balanced over the rocky ground. At times, the canyon floor narrowed so much he had to lift the sled manually over boulders or push it sideways through crevices. The heat radiating off the sandstone walls felt like an oven. He stripped down to his undershirt again, using the remains of his outer shirt as a makeshift head covering. At every stop to catch his breath, he found himself checking Lorina's surface for new cracks, terrified he might see larger fissures. Indeed, more lines spread across her arms. He muttered encouragement to her, as if she could hear. The only answer was silence. Nightfall arrived swiftly on Nephis, the twin suns sinking below the horizon. Without direct sunlight, the canyon cooled rapidly. Steve debated whether to continue or to make camp. The environment turned treacherous in the dark, and he risked damaging Lorina's statue if he stumbled. Yet time was short. In the end, he decided to push on until he found a slightly wider clearing in the canyon where he could rest. He was aware of every second ticking away, envisioning bits of stone flaking from her form. He made a crude camp, setting up a small perimeter alarm in case of wild creatures or scavengers. The canyons were known to hide more than just ancient tombs. But exhaustion forced him to stop, if only for a few hours. He took a moment to scan Lorina's stone face by the light of a small lantern, feeling a pang in his chest. Her features remained hauntingly beautiful, albeit forever frozen in a look of terror. Her parted lips, her wide-open eyes, each carved line capturing a fraction of the horror she must have felt. He settled next to her, ignoring the bedroll because he wanted to remain vigilant. He found the sound of his own breathing unnerving in the near-total silence. Eventually, he drifted into a restless sleep, dreaming of swirling sand and the sensation of hard stone slipping through his fingertips. An alert beep woke him. The perimeter sensor had detected movement. Heart racing, he checked the area. Nothing. Possibly a small desert creature or a gust of wind shifting the sensors. Still, his mind replayed 1,000 worst-case scenarios. If thieves or other mercenaries arrived, they might try to seize Lorina's statue, thinking it valuable. Or GHF enforcers might come to retrieve the artifact by force. But the canyon returned to silence, and after some minutes, his heart settled. At dawn, with the pale light creeping over the canyon ridge, he set off again. The path twisted downward, following what had once been a riverbed. Strange markings on the canyon walls hinted at ancient water levels, adding to the sense that this planet had once been more hospitable. Hour by hour, the path narrowed until it opened into a small valley. There, rising from the ground, was a smaller pyramid-like structure, similar in style to the first but less imposing. Vines, or what passed for vines on Nephis, draped the edges, and the entrance was marked by a triangular doorway half buried in loose debris. He carefully maneuvered Lorina's sled to the threshold. The door was flanked by pillars carved with swirling patterns reminiscent of the writing on the transmutation matrix. He felt a small surge of hope. If Lorina's notes were correct, this was the place. The Restoration Temple. The last chance. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. The main chamber was circular, ringed by tall pillars that rose to a domed ceiling. The faint glow of bioluminescent moss or fungus clung to corners of the architecture, providing dim, ghostly light. At the center stood a raised platform with carvings that formed a circle. Steve gently placed Lorina on the platform, heart pounding with a mixture of relief and anxiety. As he stepped back, examining the pillars, lights flared to life along the etched lines. He spun, aiming his weapon out of instinct, but the source was no physical threat. A holographic figure manifested in the center of the ring, seemingly composed of swirling blue lines that formed a tall, slender shape. A Nephian, presumably, with 4 arms and an elongated skull. The figure's eyes glowed with a soft luminescence. Its voice resonated in the chamber, but the words were in the ancient language. Startled, Steve fumbled with Lorina's tablet, which had a translation algorithm, but the Guardian hologram seemed to recognize the device. It switched to a basic version of Galactic Common, its tone echoing from every wall. "You bring one who is petrified," it said. "Do you seek restoration?" He nodded, voice hoarse. "Yes, she was transformed by the transmutation matrix. I need to save her." The hologram regarded him with a tilt of its head. "Restoration requires life. An exchange." "Do you accept the price?" He hesitated, fear clenching his gut. He had no idea what the price might be, but there was no turning back. "I'll pay it," he said, stepping forward. "Just bring her back." The platform began to glow, and the pillars vibrated with an energy that hummed across his skin. He felt a surge of static in the air, the same sense of impending power as in the first temple. The hologram's voice layered over itself, speaking Nephian words that the translator could only partially interpret. He picked up references to shared essence, bond, fate intertwined. He only cared that it might save Lorena. With trembling hands, he placed his palms on her stone shoulders. The guardian instructed him to hold still, to maintain contact. Then a brilliant beam of blue-white light descended from the dome above, enveloping both him and Lorena. He cried out as an icy fire seemed to course through his veins, a sensation of his very life being siphoned away. But he gritted his teeth, refusing to release her. Beneath his hands the stone began to crack, not in the sense of fracturing, but in the sense of splitting open, revealing patches of yellow skin beneath. A savage pulse thundered in his ears. It felt as though decades of his life were being stripped from him. Memories flooded his mind, the illusions of birthdays he had never celebrated, of battles he had fought, of mistakes he had made. He glimpsed fleeting images of Lorena's perspective, or what he imagined might be her perspective, glimpses of her homeworld, her academic achievements, her sense of wonder at the galaxy. The exchange blurred the lines between them. When the light receded, Steve collapsed to his knees, barely conscious. Lorena was no longer stone. She lay there, skin returned to its bright yellow hue, though it was covered in a thin sheen of dust or residue. She coughed, a sharp, painful intake of breath that sounded like a newborn's first cry. Her silver hair matted to her forehead. He summoned what strength he had left, leaning over her, tears welling in his eyes. "Lorena," he whispered, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and she gazed at him in confusion before recognition dawned. "Steve?" she rasped. Then her voice wavered. I remember darkness. I heard you, or thought I did. You saved me." He laughed, breathless with relief, ignoring the bone-deep fatigue weighing him down. "Welcome back." He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Lorena managed to catch him, reversing their roles from mere moments ago. She held him as best she could, though she, too, was weak. The hologram's voice filled the chamber again. "The exchange is complete. A bond has been formed. Cherish it or let it fade with time. Either way, you carry each other's essence." Steve could hardly parse those words through his dizziness. He felt Lorena's hand tremble on his arm. She looked at him with wide eyes. "A bond? Steve, I can feel you." Her brow furrowed as if she were sensing something in her mind or heart. "Your emotions?" He blinked, dazed. I think I feel yours too." Before either could ask more questions, the hologram flickered and disappeared. The pillars went dim, leaving only the faint glow of the alien moss and the residual lights along the platform. They sat in silence for a long moment, leaning on one another. Steve felt an odd swirl of warmth in his chest that wasn't his own. It radiated from Lorena, her relief, her gratitude, her deep affection for him. Meanwhile, she seemed to flinch, eyes widening as she picked up his jumbled mix of anxiety, exhaustion, and fierce protectiveness. Eventually, she helped him to his feet. They stumbled out of the temple together, leaning against each other for support. The canyon wind had died down, making the world eerily still beneath the early morning sky. They found a small ledge to sit on, catching their breath and trying to come to terms with what had just happened. He checked the time. They had spent hours in that temple, he wasn't sure how long. Lorena gingerly touched her arm where stone cracks had once been. She flexed her fingers and tested her limbs, as if expecting them to break. Then she glanced at him. "You've done so much for me. Steve, I heard you sometimes when I was stone, almost like echoes in a dream. Are you all right? You look pale." "I feel older," he admitted, rubbing his forehead. "The guardian said something about a life exchange. I guess I gave you some of my years." He tried to shrug it off, but the words lodged like a bitter truth in his throat. She pressed a hand to his cheek, her eyes brimming with gratitude and guilt. "I won't pretend to understand it fully, but I owe you everything." Then her expression softened. "You saw glimpses of my thoughts, didn't you? I saw bits of yours. We have a connection now." He exhaled slowly, leaning into her touch. In that moment he realized how precious her warmth was compared to the cold stone he had held earlier. "Looks like we're stuck with each other in more ways than one." Though exhaustion weighed heavily on them, there was a spark between them that had never quite been acknowledged. The tenuous line they walked between professional respect and personal affection had been shattered by this ordeal, replaced by a deeper bond they both felt. Lorena's mind brushed against his, sending a gentle pulse of relief and something warmer, more intimate. They decided to rest for a few hours, but not in the temple. Lorena was wary of the residual energies within, and Steve agreed. They managed to set up camp not far from the entrance, using the small clearing he had used the night before. She insisted on doing a medical check on him with the ship's portable scanner, verifying that he was stable. While the device confirmed his life signs were normal, it showed a subtle shift in his metabolic readings, consistent with a loss of longevity. For a human, losing 10 years might not be immediate tragedy, but it was a heavy price indeed. Yet he felt strangely at peace with it, especially when Lorena gently held his hand, her renewed strength palpable. In the hush of the canyon they dozed, letting their minds drift. Occasionally he felt flickers of her dreams, the edges of her consciousness. It unsettled him, but it also comforted him, knowing he wasn't alone in the vastness of this desert. They woke to the beep of an incoming transmission on Lorena's device. Director Harlow's face filled the small screen, a stern gray-haired man who was their contact at GHF. "Bell, Thassi," he intoned, using their surnames. "I need an update. Our intelligence indicates you've come into contact with the transmutation matrix. We have reason to believe that device has lethal potential beyond what we initially suspected. Secure it immediately and deliver it to GHF headquarters. Under no circumstances are you to tamper with it further." Steve exchanged a glance with Lorena. She furrowed her brow, then spoke in a shaky voice. "Director, the artifact nearly killed me. You're not telling us everything, are you?" Harlow's face remained impassive. "We've discovered additional data about Nephian war records. They used the Matrix in mass petrification campaigns against enemy populations. This is not just a cultural relic, it's a weapon of mass destruction." Lorena stared, her knuckles whitening around the device. Steve felt her horror through their bond, like a ripple of cold fear. "We can't let it fall into the wrong hands. Director, you must see that." Harlow's expression was stony. "Precisely why GHF must retrieve it. There are unscrupulous governments and factions out there willing to pay dearly for such a weapon. We will safeguard it. Now, do your job." The transmission cut off before they could protest. For a long moment, neither spoke. Steve finally broke the silence. "So it was a weapon all along, and GHF wants it. We never signed up for that." Lorena closed her eyes, anger and apprehension flickering across her face. "There are references in Nephian texts that the Matrix also had beneficial uses, like the preservation technique that was intended to be reversible. But if it can wipe out entire populations by turning them to stone," her voice trailed off, the moral implications evident. Steve clenched his jaw. Harlow sounded pretty adamant. "Something tells me they won't just let us walk away, not after we've discovered the truth." Lorena chewed her lip. "I need to check the data on how to neutralize the weapon function. There might be a failsafe. The inscriptions in the first temple suggested a second device, a counterpart that could reverse or neutralize the destructive capabilities." He nodded, remembering the strong sense of power in that first chamber. "If we can disable the Matrix's weapon side, maybe we can still salvage its positive uses without handing a doomsday device to GH." Gathering what strength they had, they made their way back to the Starseeker. Lorena's legs were shaky but functional, and Steve's own limbs felt leaden. They had only meager rations left, and they took a quick meal of processed protein bars. Then Lorena keyed in a new set of coordinates from her notes. Apparently, the original pyramid had deeper chambers they had not explored, or perhaps a hidden failsafe that required 2 guardians. Her interpretation of the Nephian language pointed to a ritual that only a bonded pair could perform. Their bond was new, raw, a side effect of that life exchange. The thought that it might be the key to disabling the weapon both intrigued and frightened them. But they had no choice. If GHF got hold of an intact, fully functioning transmutation matrix, it could trigger galaxy-wide chaos. They lifted off again, the journey taking them across the planet's equatorial deserts. This time, a different route of storms hammered the ship. The entire craft shuddered, and Steve had to concentrate on the controls to keep them airborne. Lorena sat beside him, accessing her research on the console. Occasionally, she'd reach out and give his arm a reassuring squeeze, a wordless thanks for all he had done. He couldn't help but notice how intensely he could feel her presence in his mind, like a low-level hum of awareness. While the autopilot held them steady for a few minutes, Steve took the chance to read more of her translations. He learned about the Nephian downfall. They had discovered transmutation technology that could reshape matter, but in their ambition they weaponized it, leading to internal strife and ultimately their civilization's collapse. The temples were built to house these powerful artifacts, and the Restoration Temple was a secondary measure for reversing accidental petrifications, or deliberate ones deemed reversible. By late afternoon, they landed near the original ruins, the place where Lorena had been turned to stone. The site looked ominous under the slanted light, as though overshadowed by the tragedies it had caused. The minute they powered down, they received a new transmission from Harlow. This time, not a simple order, but a threat. "We know you're meddling with the device. If you interfere with its function, you'll be in violation of our contract. Stand by for a retrieval team." Steve clenched his fists. Lorena glanced at him, fear and determination in her eyes. She felt his tension, and he felt her anxious excitement. Without a word, they stepped out of the ship. Their environment suits automatically adjusted to the desert temperature, and they trudged back toward the temple's entrance. Inside, the corridor seemed more foreboding than before, likely because they knew the artifact's true potential. In the main chamber, the altar still stood with the cube at its center, this time dark, dormant, as if waiting. The old swirl of oppressive energy lingered, raising the hairs on Steve's arms. Lorena approached carefully, scanning the markings on the floor. She motioned for Steve to stand at the opposite side of the altar. When they both stepped onto specific symbols, lines across the floor lit up, forming concentric circles around the pedestal. An inscription glowed, and their bond flared in their minds. "The failsafe is keyed to 2 bonded guardians," Lorena murmured. "It requires unity of consciousness. That's us." She read from the swirling lines, voice trembling. "We must will the matrix to transform from destroyer to preserver. That requires total synergy between us. Are you ready?" He swallowed hard. "Yes." Deep down, he felt a small flare of fear. Synergy would mean opening himself entirely, letting her see every corner of his mind. But the alternative, handing the weapon to GHF, was unacceptable. They closed their eyes, each resting one hand on the altar. Steve felt Lorena's presence surge through his consciousness, their bond magnified. His breathing caught as he felt her memories more intensely, her childhood under the soft amber skies of her home planet, the day she left for the Galactic University, the humiliations she endured from xenophobic professors, the triumphs of her earliest archaeological discoveries. He also felt her awe whenever she looked at the stars, her wonder at the expanse of the galaxy, her sense of purpose. She, in turn, experienced him, a tumultuous childhood in the Martian arcologies, the youth spent enlisting in off-world militaries, the moral compromises of a mercenary life, the weariness of constant conflict, and the small glimmer of hope he'd found in having a friend like her. She saw how he had once valued money or survival over higher ideals, yet gradually discovered a sense of honor from her influence. In the midst of this exchange, the cube on the altar began to glow, faintly at first, then building into a golden radiance. The entire chamber thrummed with power. Steve could barely differentiate his emotions from Lorena's, so blended were they. He only knew that the synergy was intensifying. The swirl of warm gold spread from the altar outward in spirals, wrapping around them, sweeping across the temple floor. Where the lines touched the walls, ancient carvings flared to life. The hum rose to a near-deafening pitch, a wave of euphoria mixed with terror. They were witnessing the total reconfiguration of the Matrix's capabilities. Steve dimly heard a roar of engines outside, perhaps the arrival of GHF forces, but it was too late for interference. The energy peaked, and the cube emitted a final flash. Then the light receded, leaving behind a hush so profound that Steve's ears rang. Lorena gasped, staggering. Steve caught her before she fell. The artifact now glowed with a steady, gentle light, no longer the ominous blue from before, but a warm amber. The markings around them flickered and dimmed, as if the temple recognized the process was complete. They stood in silence, hands still clasped. The Nephian failsafe had been activated. The Matrix was now locked into a restorative or creative mode, incapable of weaponized petrification. Steve could sense that it was done, and from the tears in Lorena's eyes, so could she. A commotion echoed from the corridor. Within moments, heavily armed GHF enforcers poured into the chamber, rifles raised. Director Harlow followed, wearing a scowl that bordered on fury. "What have you done?" he spat, striding forward to examine the artifact. Steve positioned himself between Harlow and the altar. Lorena, though trembling, did the same. Their bond buzzed with a sense of unity. They spoke as one, Lorena forming the words, Steve lending his presence. "We've removed its ability to harm. The Matrix no longer serves as a weapon." Harlow's lips curled. "You were contracted to deliver it, not sabotage it." "You mean not remove its deadly aspect?" Steve retorted, clenching his fists. "We saved Lorena's life, and we saved countless others who might have been killed if you had gotten your hands on a fully armed doomsday device." With a hand signal from Harlow, the enforcers advanced, but Lorena raised her scanning device. "Don't do this," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling in her posture. "You can take the artifact, but it won't serve your agenda." Harlow sneered. "And how can we trust that? We'll dissect every corner of this ruin if we must. You and Bell are in breach of contract." Steve stepped closer, overshadowing the older man with his imposing frame. "We're walking away," he said flatly. "With or without the Matrix. If you want a caretaker for it, we'll do that ourselves. Somewhere far from your reach." Harlow nodded to his enforcers, who raised their weapons. Tension snapped taut. Steve braced to fight, though he was still tired and his heart hammered with the after-effects of the ritual. In that moment, a surge of resolution from Lorena's mind flowed into his, galvanizing him. She refused to stand aside. She had nearly died for this technology. She would not see it twisted into a weapon again. But the next moment, the artifact itself pulsed. Once, a soft, luminous flare that spread through the chamber. The GHF enforcers flinched, stepping back, their eyes flicking to the altar. Harlow took a step back, confusion etched on his face. It was as if the Matrix recognized a threat to its new configuration. Yet it did not attack or petrify anyone. It merely emitted a warning glow. Realizing that a standoff could end in violence, Steve locked eyes with Lorena. Through their bond, they communicated faster than words. They had to leave, now. She nodded. Together they moved quickly, weaving around the enforcers who seemed momentarily off guard. Steve slammed the butt of his rifle into the faceplate of one guard, knocking him out, while Lorena ducked under a second guard's swing. Harlow shouted a command, but in that brief confusion they sprinted for the corridor. They had the advantage of knowing these corridors, while the GHF soldiers were uncertain about triggering any additional temple defenses. Gunfire echoed behind them, but they were already around the next bend. They emerged into the harsh sunlight and sprinted across the sand toward the Starseeker. Steve barked out a voice command and the ship's ramp descended. Lorena dashed inside, hitting the emergency lift button that would whisk them to the cockpit. Steve followed, covering their retreat. Once inside, he retracted the ramp. They could hear distant shouting, but the temple's massive shape obstructed direct lines of fire. As soon as the ramp sealed, he fired the engines. The Starseeker rattled violently, half buried in swirling dust kicked up by the thrusters. He forced the ship skyward, leaving behind the temple's spire and the furious GHF entourage. It was a reckless, near-vertical ascent that strained the engines to their limit, but within minutes, they broke free into the upper atmosphere. He stabilized the craft and let out a long breath, heart still hammering. Lorena collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, wiping sweat from her brow. She turned to him, and even before she spoke, he felt her waves of relief and gratitude. "We did it," she murmured. "We stopped them from getting a weapon." He nodded, meeting her gaze. "At a cost, though. We're likely fugitives now." A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "So be it." She glanced at the navigation controls. "Where do we go?" He exhaled, considering the galactic maps in his mind. Maybe an uncharted research outpost on the outer rim. Maybe a hidden colony that disliked GHF meddling. Somewhere quiet, far from GHF's jurisdiction. We can figure out how the reconfigured matrix works, and maybe find a way to use it for good. She leaned back, eyes closed, letting the reality sink in. Her mind brushed his again, sending a wave of warmth that made his chest tighten. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving up so much, for saving me." His throat felt tight. "I'd do it again," he admitted, and deep in his heart he understood that losing a decade of life was a small price if it meant keeping her alive. More than that, the bond they now shared felt strangely right, an unexpected gift from an ancient technology meant to preserve life, not destroy it. As the Starseeker breached the planet's outer atmosphere, the twin suns grew smaller behind them, shining with a fierce orange glow. Steve programmed a jump to a remote region well away from GHF patrol routes. The ship's FTL drive hummed, spooling up. Lorena watched the swirling starlight from the cockpit window, tears slipping down her cheeks. Tears of sorrow for what they had gone through, and perhaps for her lost illusions about a purely scholarly pursuit. But also tears of joy. She was alive, bonded in a way she never imagined, and they had done the right thing. He placed a hand on her shoulder. She touched it, then slid her fingers through his, letting him feel her gratitude and affection through that mental link. Neither needed words to express the complexity of it all. In that silent exchange, they forged an unspoken promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The star lines elongated and the ship surged into faster-than-light travel. In the swirling void beyond, a new chapter of their lives began. They carried with them an artifact that had once been a weapon of horrifying power, now transformed into something that might, with careful study, heal and restore. And they carried each other, an odd couple joined by chance, by fate, and by something deeper that transcended species and backgrounds. The thought that gnawed at Steve's mind was the cost, the decade of life he had sacrificed, the breach of their contract with GHF, the uncertainty of a future on the run. Yet any regret was overshadowed by the simple fact that Lorena breathed beside him, free of stone, her skin glowing with renewed vitality. If he had learned anything, it was that some bonds were worth any sacrifice. As the Starseeker flew into the unknown, he closed his eyes, letting exhaustion carry him into a half-doze. Lorena guided the ship's course, her own fatigue balanced by her determination. Together they soared past the last vestiges of Nephus's gravitational pull, leaving behind the planet's scorching deserts and the shattered remnants of a warlike civilization. The Nephians, once so mighty, had never grasped that ultimate power inevitably demanded ultimate responsibility. Steve and Lorena now held a slender thread of that responsibility, bound inextricably by the artifact's final gift. In their minds, the bond gently pulsed, a living testament to the difference between forging a weapon and forging a connection. There would be challenges, conflicts, and compromises in the days ahead, but for now, they had each other, and they had hope. Hope that an ancient terror had been neutralized, and that a fragile peace might emerge from the dust of a forgotten world. Their story was just beginning, an unexpected love born of crisis, an alliance tested by extremes, and a promise that even in a galaxy full of perils, compassion could transform the darkest legacy into a force for life. Nothing else remained of Nephis but a pinpoint of fading light on the star charts, as the Star Seeker folded space and moved beyond the reach of the past. Steve, slumped in the pilot's seat, and Lorena, guiding them forward, silently agreed. If the galaxy needed another chance to do the right thing with advanced technology, they would be its guardians. Together,